Live.
Recording in progress.
Hi, good afternoon, Steve and Ellen. Hello. There's still people trickling into the room, so maybe we'll give it 1 minute if it's okay with the two of you.
Do you want me to go? Sure.
Yeah, please. Yeah, thanks, Daphne. I'll wait for you, Daphne. Thank you. We'll wait. While we wait, are there any comments or questions?
Can I just say,
Sure.
I, for those of you who haven't checked your WhatsApp, I've suggested that there's so much good energy and good questions in this room, and we can't get to all of them. So maybe if you had a burning question for whatever topic, if you could put it in WhatsApp, then other people who are interested in the topic or have responses can at least connect with you, when we're having dinner or lunch or something, so we know who's interested in and what kind of concerns.
And one of the wonderful traditions and spaces in this culture, and there are nice things in this culture, is the pub.
Yes.
And pubs are wonderful places to have a drink, to socialize, debate, teach, learn, argue, and have fun.
And just also, I put up a link to the resources that I've talked about at that project that I did. It's all freely available for teaching purposes. So it's copyright free. If anything's useful to you, grab it. If it's not, dismiss it. And I'm really happy to speak as somebody who teaches religious studies in a secular university.
Thank
Cool.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I think we're going to start. Okay, we're going to start. So today, for the last session of the day, before we have our theatrical interlude with Marlon, I'm happy you're here. The final session is dealing with two important issues with two wonderful scholars, really leaders in their field. We have Ellen Cannon, who's from the Department of Political Science and Jewish Studies at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago. She's also a senior fellow with us at ISGAP and one of the movers and shakers of ISGAP and of the Jewish community and the academic world. The topic of her presentation today is Soviet propaganda, so it dovetails nicely on one of the presentations we had earlier, and its impact and role in the normalization of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in American higher education, so an important focus. And we're also fortunate to be joined by Professor Steve Ross. Steve is from the Department of History and is the Myron and Miriam Director of the Kasdan Institute for the Study of Jewish Role in American Life at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. He's going to speak about, the title of his talk is The Secret War Against Hate, American Resistance to Anti-Semitism and White Supremacy After 1945. So I will give the floor to Ellen, if that's okay, and the floor is yours. And Ellen, thank you very much for being here. After your presentation, I'll call on Steve to do his presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A for both of you. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi to all of you who are there, and I know that you're having a wonderful conference, and we hope to see you regularly in ISGAP. Let me begin. Writing in 1762, Rousseau, in his work Emile, writes the following: "If someone dared to publish among us books that openly favored Judaism, we would punish the author, the publisher, the book dealer. It is easy to refute people who do not dare speak. I will never believe," he writes, "that I have rightly heard the voice of the Jews, reasoning as long as they do not have a free state, schools and universities where they might speak and argue without risk. We need to hear the voice of the Jews." Professor Pessin and Benatar agree in their important work on anti-Semitism on campus. They write the following: "The word Judaism to Israel and Jews to Zionists, and Rousseau's 18th century observation is disturbingly applicable to today's campus." They go on to say that those in the academy who support Israel, or who merely do not despise Israel, are finding it increasingly difficult to speak up without risking verbal attacks, social and professional ostracism to their careers, and sometimes even physical threats. As a result, Israel-friendly voice on campus globally is being silenced. The question that consumes me, absolutely consumes me, is who will speak for the Jews? In any democracy, who gets to speak? But who today speaks for the Jew? And my answer is, we, the academic community, must speak up, not only as supporters of Israel, but as Jews, as knowledgeable Jews, as Jews that bring something to the table other than emotion, which is always good anyway. Today's campus orthodoxy sees Israel as a highly flawed location whose citizens are not indigenous to the land, who have usurped the rights of Palestinians, and the new campus orthodoxy sees only an apartheid regime founded on racism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and colonial imperialism. The new orthodoxy, especially in the humanities and the soft social sciences, argue that Zionism cannot be defended or corrected because the very idea of a Jewish democracy is an offensive oxymoron that can only perpetuate the unjust and discriminatory status quo. Israel and Zionism are cast as illegitimate, incorrigible abominations. The attack on Israel is much more than an attack on Jews and Israel. As Stanford University President John Hennessy has warned, the atmosphere of intimidation, of vitriol on campus endangers our ability to operate as an intellectual community. Or, in other words, anti-Israelism is an attack on the very norms and values of the university, and even more important, on the norms and values of Western civilization. The subject of Israel is no longer studied factually or objectively, but highly politicized, promoting Jews, Israel, and Zionism as forces of oppression and domination, in contrast to Palestinians, who are depicted as the oppressed, the spokespersons for social justice and human rights. Professors and students silence and often humiliate students and faculty who disagree with their perspectives. Jewish students have been turned away from joining campus clubs, journals, student government, once they verbalize support for Israel or Zionism. Professional faculty organizations have made it extremely challenging for faculty to fail the ideological litmus test of what constitutes correct positions on Israel, the Middle East conflict, and diaspora cultures and politicized. This development cannot be understood, I contend, without an examination of the role of the Soviet Union creating and promoting the cultural foundations of anti-Zionism, anti-Israelism, and anti-Semitism, which the progressive wing and the left-wing academic community in the humanities and the social sciences have absorbed. My research examines the ideological framework and pedagogy of 4 distinct Soviet regimes, who developed and institutionalized through the process of higher education this propaganda over time. The ideological and educational framework has greatly influenced the American Academy, as reflected in politicalization of the Academy, the substitution of ideology and activism for scholarship, and the hidden political agendas of pedagogy and research, which are often not understood or recognized by students as even lacking in objectivity while promoting fabrication as truth. Today, I will only share with you a very small portion of the study of these 4 regimes. And what I will do is take questions on the following 4 regimes during our question and answers. I look at Lenin and Stalin this morning with you primarily, but my work looks at Khrushchev and Brezhnev, often overlooked as real factors in the development of this, not only in the institutions of learning in the Soviet Union, but its promulgation in our own. In 1921, the USSR emerges from the Civil War with a ruined economy in which the Soviet Jews are in desperate straits. The shtetl Jews, which are 70% of the population, suffered disproportionately under the Tsars. Most were pushed into poverty, being labeled non-productive petite bourgeoisie as a legal indication. As a result of this categorization, they were considered disenfranchised citizens under the 1918 Bolshevik Constitution, which resulted in their loss of their civil rights, including opportunities for employment, housing, and higher education. State planners confronted the issue of the stagnant economy by a policy aimed at attracting ethnic groups to communism by permitting a degree of cultural autonomy among national territorial entities, as well as to modernize them through education and the transformation of occupational patterns. Lenin faces the Jewish question, and his notion of solving the Jewish question is what he calls Jewish assimilation. By that, he employs propaganda as one tool to promote the homogenization and transformation not only of the Jews, but of all what he calls non-Russians, non-Slavic, and non-Russian Orthodox groups. The propaganda included artistic posters reflecting images of the transformation of what he called his new Jews, in terms of, he said, how we teach them to talk, dress, and think as new members of the Soviet regime. The propaganda served to rid the new culture of Tsarist imagery and create a new images for the Jew and introduce new symbols of what Lenin said is the egalitarian life under socialism that embraced ethnic minorities. Although anti-Semitism was not to be tolerated under the Constitution, this longest hatred absolutely continued. His program for the Jews, as for other minority nationalities, was assimilation and the absorption of the particularisms of our Jewish culture to be replaced by institutions representing the Bolshevization of Jews into the entire Soviet existence. Thus, during the 1920s, the Communist Party, just to deal with the Jews, developed the Jewish section to bring the dictatorship of the proletariat to the Jewish masses, especially those raised in the shtetls. The Jewish section was charged with constructing new forms of Jewish life through Yiddishization and Bolshevization of basic organizations of social and cultural life. And during this brief period, secular Yiddish socialist language cultural institutions, including publishing houses, journals, newspapers, literary and theatrical troupes, they begin to flourish. The Jewish economic and national problems, according to Lenin, were supposed to be solved by creating a world for the Jews, but the loss of everything that constituted being a Jew. What he sees the Jew as is an economic caste, which over time will move into the realm of everyday life once we have the revolution. The revolution was a class revolution. The Jews were a caste. They would be casting off their entire connectedness to Jewish life. By January 30th, the Jewish section of the Communist Party was terminated, and under Stalin, as we will see, all of the Yiddishist equipment saying some form of linguistic attachment to being Jewish is terminated under Stalin. During the years 1918 to 22, the Soviet state undertook active steps to combat anti-Semitism by means of oral propaganda and the publication of pamphlets and books with more than 100 publications printed. The central question was, in all of them, the Jewish question. And, he argues, because Jews are an economic caste, I see anti-Semites as the foes of their former economic role. The class role and the class war will make Jews into good proletarian and anti-capitalists. At the same time, the Soviet state promoted the assimilation of Soviet Jewry, discriminatory barriers affecting higher education and career opportunities, especially in the fields that may be considered political and security risks, are not open to Jews. The barriers are sustained and reinforced by destructive anti-Zionist campaigns, which included ancient anti-Semitic tropes, which were further amplified and underscored by the publication and the fabrication that was an intrinsic part of Soviet reintroduction of Soviet ideas. Implicit in this is the adoption of the ideas of the protocols of the elders of Zion. Although Lenin was primarily focused on the realization of the revolutionary workers in Russia, he views Zionism as nothing more than a diversion of Jewish workers, and their primary task is the class struggle. And he says this must be the only thing that the Jews focus on. In 1913, Lenin denounces Jewish national culture and the politics of Zionism as representing the slogans of rabbis and bourgeois. Both are the foes of the new Russia. At the same time, the language that Lenin uses towards Zionism at a period of time when Zionism is a peripheral issue and clearly not a major concern, will not only be used by future Soviet leadership, but by the left and progressive academicians and researchers in the 20th and 21st centuries in American academics. Zionism, he argues, is part of the larger colonialist, imperialist, Western ideology and movement that in the name of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine throws the Arab community under the bus. The Arab working class is to be exploited by the British and then the Jews. That is, says Lenin, despicable. Thus, Jews, as part of the issue in Palestine, according to Lenin, are nothing more than Europeans supported by the Balfour Declaration and are intrinsic not to a Jewish project, but to the British imperial project. And thus begins his call, Lenin's call, for the Arabization of the Palestine Communist Party to take an active role in fighting any what he calls intrusion of Zionism in this early period. Furthermore, although emigration of Soviet Jews to Israel would become a highly contentious issue, at this time, young Zionists who, because they were Zionists, were imprisoned or exiled, were given a short window of opportunity to renounce their Soviet citizenship and emigrate to Palestine. This framing is extremely important in our study of the notion of how higher education is utilized by Lenin to promote this kind of propaganda. So how does Lenin feel about higher education? And listen carefully, because you're going to hear the echo of contemporary worlds with following. Education must be intrinsically linked to both politics and ideology. Its objective is ending oppression and the revolutionary struggle. Education cannot be conducted apart from politics. As the Soviet Union is the center of gravity of the struggle to end oppression, the USSR serves as a model to counter through education the hegemonic imperialism of the West. Education must reinvent thinking as a creative counterforce to capitalism. It must ensure that students understand the evil future that capitalism holds. Education is an opposing force to exploitation and domination. Education is to provide a pragmatic approach to reality. And in that effort, he says, teaching and agitation are necessary to the struggle to end oppression and domination. Thus, he says, it is essential for the teachers in higher education to study accurately the role of propaganda and agitation as a major part of education. Teaching and agitation are to be linked to propaganda as it provides the masses with alternative views. And who are the teachers, he states? The army of our teachers must all be an army of socialist teachers. Old ways of thinking are not easily removed and will take organizing. The role of the teacher is also to develop the organizing of the politics of the students. Learning is not for its own sake, but eventually building a society for everyone. And in order for this to develop a new conscious mass movement requiring agitation and propaganda must be institutionalized. Lenin plays a critical role in institutionalizing his unity of the proletariat by utilizing governmental restrictions and educational institutions regarding what he viewed as correct education and socialization of the masses. By 1921, the net production policy established a clear Soviet ideology for higher education institutions. And the main point for Lenin is to develop a centralized command structure of all departments, ending the autonomy of professors, having their own professional organizations in their field of expertise. For Lenin, all notions of professional autonomy are incompatible with the state. Professors fiercely resisted this reform, arguing that scholarship has to be objective and apolitical. Lenin vehemently disagrees, arguing the very term apolitical or non-political education is nothing more than bourgeois hypocrisy. It's a deception to the masses. Education, he argues, must be connected to the politics of the state, as defined by the state. Furthermore, argued Lenin, to allow educators with non-Soviet views, what he calls alien ideologies, to have access to the students will corrupt our university students who would become, in the future, Soviet Russian elites, and access to them is not acceptable. So one of the first groups to continue the protest were the engineers, and they argued, we firmly assert our neutrality to our profession. We do not adhere to state ideology tactics or of any political party whose expertise is not advancing engineering. Physicians offered the fiercest opposition to government directives, saying that bureaucrats are not scientifically and medically trained. Lenin made it clear to medical journalists and philosophers that there is no place for you in this regime, and he stated that so-called vibrancy of literary intelligentsia is nothing but a facade that works against the Soviet Revolution. And to further cement the ideology to professional life, Lenin proceeds to establish watchdog groups to promote enemy publications and further the promotion and institutionalization of censorship. And according to Lenin, words are weapons, and just as the revolution cannot allow just anybody to have revolvers and machine guns, since they might be malicious enemies, so too the state cannot permit ideas that challenge the revolution. Words are essential. And on words, this is exactly what Lenin goes on to say.
Ellen, sorry, you have about 4 or 5 minutes, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. He goes, words are used in the following manner in an effort to promote the revolution. They must provoke the reader or audience towards hatred, disgust, contempt, in order to understand who our enemies are. Phrasing must be calculated to continue, but not to convince, but to destroy, not to correct the adversary's mistake, but to annihilate their organization and wipe it off from the face of the earth. When you read today the work of the BDS movement and the Students for Justice in Palestine, you are hearing this kind of notion of the verbiage of what we must bring to the educational academy. So he makes it clear that he will watch carefully the following professionals: doctors, professors, lawyers, engineers, agronomists, technicians, for telling the future anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist show trials that would occur under Stalin. Lenin encourages those kind of trials against anti-Soviet intellectuals. They were arrested, interrogated, deported from Moscow, Petrograd, and the Ukraine. Conviction was, of course, predetermined, as was their uniformed sentencing. When we look back at the two that I wanted to discuss today, Lenin and Stalin, what we find is that the Jews are unique in that they are a particular target of arrests, of being accused, of being arrested, of being physically abused, and how Stalin carries this on is one of the greatest tragedies in Russian as well as Jewish history. When I take questions, I would be delighted to take questions on Stalin and on Khrushchev and Brezhnev as well. Thank you for your courtesy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ellen. As usual, thank you. And we'll turn the floor, give the floor to Steve, and then when Steve is done, we'll have Q&A for both of you. Steve, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Hi, welcome. I'm sorry I can't be with you all in person. I'm going to put up a PowerPoint that I have here that we'll use. There we go. What I want to do is talk to you in a sense about how did we get to January 6th, 2021. Because what the nation witnessed that afternoon was something bigger than Donald Trump, bigger than any one person or any one party. I would argue that what we saw on January 6th goes back to 1945, when Americans began fighting a second civil war over two distinct visions of the future and have continued fighting ever since. It's important to point out the anti-Semitic images, not just the Confederate flags. 6 million wasn't enough, and on the other sweatshirt we have Camp Auschwitz. And it's very clear the agenda coming in with Confederate flags, coming in with the sense that they were patriots, saving America from the perversions of liberals and the left. Well, Americans today would like to believe that World War II brought a decrease in hate and a new era of tolerance. Nothing could be further from the truth. These are the iconic images of the end of World War II, the celebration, the greatest generation celebrating what we now think of as the good war. But for many Americans, it wasn't such a good war. According to 14 public opinion polls taken in 1945, 25% of Americans were, quote, infected with anti-Semitism, 25% are opposed to anti-Semitism, and 50% have no fixed opinions and can be swayed to either side. Well, no poll ever asked people whether they were racists, but when queried in September 1945 and asked whether they would favor a law requiring employers to hire a person qualified for a job regardless of race, 43% of Americans said yes, 44% said no, and 13% had no opinions. Well, these grim statistics, combined with the outbreak of racial and anti-Semitic violence during the 40s and 50s, require us to reconsider the legacy of the good war and the greatest generation. And the cliche about it all is that here are men who went off to fight in war and met people they would never have met before, people from different backgrounds, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, kids from New York, Mississippi, California, Idaho. And while by the end of the war it wasn't Kumbaya America, there was a sense that at the very least these people deserved to live a life free of fear and violence. Black veterans as well came back with the sense that things were no longer going to be the same, and even though they fought in segregated units, they fought for their country. And having shed their blood, Black and Jewish veterans decided, quote, the time has come when they would not quietly accept second-rate citizenship. They were Americans and demanded to be treated as such. But there was a darker side to World War II, one that we don't really talk about, and that is many of the veterans who went to fight not because they opposed Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo, not because they opposed Nazism and fascism, but simply because Japan bombed us. And when someone bombs you, you fight back. They went off to war believing they were patriots, and when they came back, they discovered the nation had betrayed them. That many of them, as John Roy Carlson would write afterwards, he wrote, quote, many Americans who truly love their country are innocently drawn within the orbit of those who, under the guise of Christianity, nationalism, and America first, incite hate and disunity, and wish to preserve the Constitution by methods identical with Hitler. And most frightening of all, these people felt themselves as patriots who were killing to save America. And the story I tell in my current book starts in 1945 at the very end of the war, when after the war is over. By late fall 1945, the Ku Klux Klan begins its cross burnings yet again. And I trace, starting in 1945, Emory Burke, Jesse B. Stoner, James Maydall, and later George Lincoln Rockwell would lead a war hate that promised to, quote, finish the job Hitler had begun by building violent networks of terror and planning deadly attacks on Jews and blacks. And while these names may not be familiar to you, Stoner and Rockwell are revered today by many of the current hate groups, the Aryan Nations, etc., as the godfathers of white supremacy. And these four leaders who would work together for several decades, trying to forge an anti-Jewish, anti-black coalition that would drive them out of the country, would be opposed by three New York-based groups, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and the non-sectarian Anti-Nazi League, and the dozens of undercover agents who monitored and undermined their deadly efforts of these three groups. Well, Jews and blacks knew that they could not rely on the FBI for protection because J. Edgar Hoover had displayed little concern for the rapid growth of an American-based Nazi and fascist organizations both before and during the war, and even after the war. He continued to focus his resources on investigating alleged communists. Consequently, it would be up to the leaders of these three groups to protect Jews and blacks from harm. Well, the first effort to eliminate Jews from the American scene would come in the fall of 1946, and it would come in the South, in Atlanta, the Munich of post-war America. And imagine if the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazi-inspired German-American Bund were to have an offspring, it would look exactly like the Colombians. And as most Americans prepared for post-war peace, Colombian founders Homer Loomis Jr. and Emory Burke proposed fighting a new war. As they told their minions, what Germans have done to the Jews will be a mere tea party compared what we're going to do. We lost the war in Europe, but we're going to win the war at home. And chartered in 1946 as a nonprofit political group, the Colombians set out to establish themselves as the leading white supremacists in America. And they would do this by achieving their goals of creating a climate of fear amongst blacks and Jews, and then organizing a new political party that would pass measures expelling the Hutu hated groups from America and would kill anyone who refused to leave. Well, Burke and Loomis prepared for war by assembling an arsenal of rifles, machine guns, and dynamite, and they began using it in October 1946 when they would patrol white working class neighborhoods that were now seeing blacks moving in because of high rents, and they wanted to keep those neighborhoods white. They would attack, bomb, beat up, and attempt to murder any black family that would move into their neighborhood. Well, bombings signaled the Colombians' deadly determination to remove blacks and Jews from Atlanta. And after hearing about the anti-Semitic group, James Sheldon, who was the head of the New York-based anti-Nazi League, struck a deal with Southern-born journalist Stetson Kennedy. And in return for joining the Colombians and the Ku Klux Klan undercover and sending them reports, Sheldon paid him the $50 a week. Well, Sheldon would eventually, after Stetson Kennedy wrote about how serious the threat was, Sheldon sent in two of his most experienced operatives to break up the group, Mario Buzzi, here's Stetson Kennedy, and Rene Fruchtbaum. And arriving at Atlanta in early November, Buzzi introduced himself to Burke as Mario Falco, an Italian fascist who had come to Atlanta hoping to organize the city's Italian community into anti-Semitic organization. And he welcomed these two outsiders who came in to help, particularly Rene Fruchtbaum, who said she would come in, that she had been a secretary in New York, that she was a dedicated fascist, she had some money and would work for free, helping organize their files. And of course, they accepted that. What they didn't know is she wasn't simply organizing their files. She had a cigarette lighter that in fact was a camera. She took over 200 pictures, brought them back to New York, where James Sheldon, who we're seeing here over her shoulder, sent all 200 pages of the documents to the Georgia Assistant Attorney General, who used them to put the Colombians out of business. But the collapse of the Colombians presented an opportunity for Jesse Stoner and his Christian anti-Jewish party. Declaring himself 100% for white supremacy, the former Colombian and Ku Klux Klan leader called for every black man, woman, and child to be deported to Africa, and for every Jew to be exterminated immediately. And his incentive was incredibly appealing. When Jews were dead, American Christians would share their wealth and become wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. Well, in 1946, the white supremacist who the Ku Klux Klan expelled for being too radical in his racial views founded the Stoner Anti-Jewish Party, And 2 years later, he ran for Congress on a platform that would make Judaism a crime punishable by death. And in 1952, aided by a former Colombian strongman, Edward Fields, he promised to modernize the mass killing of Jews by employing gas chambers, electric chairs, firing squads, or whatever means were appropriate. Well, Southerners were particularly attracted to his group and his promise that, quote, when Jews are gone, the Americans will own rich America. Well, the three New York-based groups sent in undercover agents into the South to gather information, which they sent to government authorities and media outlets, and that information eventually led to the party's demise, but not to Stoner. What's interesting about the four leaders I trace is that they are often put down, one of their groups is put down, and the moment that group is down, they simply move on and ally with another group, rebuild their supporters, and then launch a new party. Well, most Americans are familiar with Southern hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan, but few know that New York City was the epicenter of the post-war Nazi movement in America, and that James Madoff hoped to head an international alliance of fascist groups powerful enough to unseat democratic governments and eliminate all minorities. As he told his supporters, what Hitler accomplished in Europe, we shall accomplish in America. He would found in 1949 the National Renaissance Party, which called for the deportation of, quote, those racial elements which cannot be assimilated within the culturally predominant white race. Puerto Ricans, Negroes, Asiatics, they would all be sent to other countries, but as for the Jews, he called for their, quote, physical extermination. Even though the National Renaissance Party never had more than several hundred members, his real impact was on the bulletin he put out, his newspaper, the National Renaissance Bulletin, which was in many ways, think of it as the Facebook of the late 40s, well, really the early 50s. It was used by extremists here and abroad as the central vehicle for exchanging information about national and international developments in the world of faith, exchanging information about who could provide them with weapons, money, and information. Well, this new group seemed to be incredibly threatening, and at which point the Anti-Nazi League would hire a series of undercover agents who went in to penetrate. And the most interesting of the early ones was Emmanuel Trujillo, who had been an Army veteran, who in 1953 was walking down the streets of the Upper East Side, Yorkville, which was the German neighborhood, when he heard James Madoff speaking outdoors, dressed and surrounded by his stormtroopers, all dressed in Nazi uniform. And after he heard him call for death to Jews, Trujillo, as a veteran, decided he needed to do something, and he offered to spy for James Sheldon. And he did, and he eventually wound up in his inner circle. Most importantly, he wound up, because he could read, speak, and write German, he wound up to become the head of their overseas operation, which meant he was communicating with a series of Nazis and fascists who had fled Spain, Germany, Italy, and were now some living in Germany and some living in countries spread around the world. He became their chief correspondent, writing, communicating, and finding out what they were doing. All the information he got was sent to Sheldon, who in turn sent it to the Army and Navy intelligence, to the CIA and the FBI. Well, Madoff would eventually be foiled by the information that Trujillo presented, and which was used by the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1954 to denounce the National Renaissance Party. Well, the exposure of Madoff's spies and the backlash from his supporters sent the National Renaissance Party into a period of temporary decline. But what we would see is the minute one hate group goes down, another one rises up. And at 3:30 a.m. on the morning of October 12, 1958, a bomb went off destroying much of the Atlanta's Hebrew Benevolent Congregation temple. Only one man was arrested, George Bright, a 34-year-old Army engineer and demolitions veteran, who was set free after a jury deadlocked 9-3 in favor of conviction. And as one of the 3 voting to quit explained, you can't send a man to penitentiary for life just because he's a Jew hater. Well, in fact, the bombing of Atlanta was simply part of a terrorist campaign organized by these various hate groups. And during a 9-week period, beginning at Christmas 1959, over 600 synagogues, Jewish schools, residences, and shops throughout the country were targeted for vandalism or destruction. Well, the Anti-Defamation League, American Jewish Committee, and Anti-Nazi League responded to the attacks on Jews and black churches by stepping up their spy operations. ADL spy master Arnold Sporster placed undercover agents in Southern Citizens Councils and in a number of anti-Jewish groups throughout the country. And when agents discovered planned plans for violence, they notified Foster, who in turn notified local authorities. And in one instance, information from the ADL's head in Miami, B. Botnick, led to the arrest of several Ku Klux Klan bombers. Well, determined to crush the National Renaissance Party, James Sheldon replaced his original 4 spies who had been exposed with a series of new spies who Madoff trained as his successors. Well, the spies from New York slowed down the bombings, but soon a new threat emerged: the formation of the National States Rights Party in 1958 by J.B. Stoner and his protege, Edward Fields, as well as Madoff, and finally the rise in 1959 of the American Nazi Party by charismatic former Navy commander George Lincoln Rockwell, who also promised to complete the job Hitler left unfinished. Rockwell's flair for the dramatic brought Nazism, fascism into a new age of media hype. Born in Bloomington, Illinois, Rockwell enlisted in the Naval Air Force in 1941 and served until October 45, when he was demobilized with the rank of lieutenant commander. He returned to active duty in 1950 to train fighter pilots for the Korean War, and a year later he had a conversion experience while reading Mein Kampf. As he wrote, I was transfixed and hypnotized. I realized that National Socialism, the iconoclastic view of Adolf Hitler, was the doctrine of scientific racial idealism, actually a new religion. And in 1958, determined to carry out Hitler's teaching, the Navy veteran joined J.B. Stoner, the Columbians' co-founder Edmund Burke, and 100 delegates from 18 states to form the National States Rights Party. A year later, he formed his own American Nazi Party with headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, where he gained national attention by always appearing in Nazi uniforms and surrounding himself with stormtroopers and swastika flags. Rockwell adopted a platform taken directly from the Columbians and Stoner's anti-Jewish party. He promised to exterminate all Jews and send every black back to Africa. After his undercover agents alerted Sheldon and Foster that the bitter rivalry between Madoff and Rockwell threatened to undermine their movements, they sent in spies to widen the division until one, if not both groups, would collapse. Well, Madoff and Rockwell soon realized their organizations had been penetrated by the Jews. And this time, the spy masters, as well as the spies, were targeted for death. As one anti-Nazi League agent warned Sheldon, be on guard, for Rockwell says he would like to cut up one of the ADL people and send his body back to the ADL offices. Well, fortunately, dissension between the two of Madoff's most devoted followers led to splinter groups that briefly allied Rockwell with Madoff. And Rockwell brought Nazism into the media age by organizing stunts that would attract national attention. In this case, in 1961, in the midst of civil rights efforts calling for integration, he sent his hate bus throughout the South on a tour trying to convince Americans that the truly patriotic way was segregation. Well, following Rockwell's assassination in August 1967, James Madoff emerged as the nation's undisputed Nazi leader. In as late as December 1967, he was speaking at rallies, crying out for "kill the Jews." Kill is not an ugly word. It is a right to destroy an enemy. There can be no coexistence between two races. One must lose. Ironically, both Rockwell and Madoff tried to make alliances with Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, arguing that both agreed on one thing, that there had to be race separation. So Rockwell is assassinated outside a laundromat, by one of his ex-leaders, John Pather, who had also been for many years with James Madoff and the National Renaissance Party. Well, the American Nazi Party declined not only after the death of its leader, but after the death of Daniel Burroughs, who committed suicide the day after the New York Times exposed him as being the son of Orthodox Jews, who in fact had been bar mitzvah. Well, Madoff's dream of becoming the next Hitler would end in 1971 when he was attacked by a disgruntled right-wing activist, beaten over the head, and he would never recover. But Stoner, in fact, would continue his campaign up until his death. And when the white supremacists we saw in Charlottesville in August 2017 would march, shocking the nation by chanting, "The Jews will not replace us," that shock would soon turn into horror as anti-Semitic attacks grew more deadly over the next 5 years, from the attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh that killed 11, to the Chabad congregation shooting that left 1 dead in Poway. And many Americans ask, how could this have happened? And the answer is, it's not surprising. These shootings, these demonstrations, the chant of "the Jews will not replace us," had been part of a long-standing battle going back to the end of World War II. And most importantly, what to understand is that these 4 leaders left a legacy. We can trace, in fact, the current leaders of various groups like the Aryan Nations, the Oath Keepers, are the grandchildren of these original so-called patriots. We see the legacies that Field and Stoner inspired. They created the American First Party that Donald Trump would play off of. Moreover, Richard Butler and the Aryan Nations were directly inspired by the teachings and preachings of J.B. Stoner. That David Duke, in turn, was inspired by George Lincoln Rockwell. And to come back here now, even though at the last interview that Stoner gave in July 2004 before his death, he expressed something that we need to be afraid of today. Because once again, these are not crazies. If we see these people as crazy, if we see them simply as right-wing demagogues, we've missed the point. They see themselves as patriots, as Christians preventing America from being perverted by left and liberals. And in fact, as Stoner would wrote, if I were still active, I'd be doing the same, defending white people against race mixing, no matter the cost. And although he didn't succeed, he said he had no regrets, for a person isn't supposed to apologize for being right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a very important contribution to our program. Thank you. I hope you're okay. No. There's a bunch of questions. I have a quick question, slightly off topic. I think Rob may want to make a contribution in a moment. You know what? Let Rob speak for a moment. Rob, you have to come here so they can hear you, if you want. I'm putting you on the spot. While Rob comes here, He's going to speak about the KKK in the United States and a personal experience he had. Part of the discourse, so there's a rise, as the United States fragments, there's a rise of white supremacy and right-wing anti-Semitism, which you've eloquently examined. I'm also interested in how Jews are defined by the other. So you have the white racists and the right defining Jews as not white and a threat to the race and the nation. But you also have the emergence now, as you know, on campuses and in elements of the Black Lives Matter and different communities where we're being portrayed as white and white supremacists. So can you speak about how the fragmentation in the United States is creating sort of this extremist ideology which defines the Jew as either not white or white? Could you talk to that for a moment, please?
Yes, I mean, one of the things when I've had a student talk about that I was part of a white supremacist establishment, I stopped the student, I simply said, "What color am I?" And they looked at me like I was crazy. And they said, "You're white." And I said, "Well, is that 100% sure, and is that timeless? Would I always be white?" "Yes." "Well, in fact, in 1920, I wasn't white. My ancestors wouldn't be white." And I tried to explain about that. And one of the important things to understand in terms of the whiteness issue is one of the things I learned in the course of the research was the power and the longevity of something known as the Christian identity movement. And that has played a critical role also in, I think, influencing right-wing people about who is white and who isn't. And the Christian identity movement is started in England in the 1890s and really grew in America in the 1930s and 40s, particularly in California with Reverend Wesley Smith. And it claimed that Jews insist that they are God's chosen people. That is not true. Jews, in fact, are the spawn of Satan and Eve, and their child was Cain. And therefore, Jews are not white. Not only are Jews not white, they're barely human, but they are still above blacks, Asian, or Asiatics as they would refer to them, who are not even human. They are mud people. They are not even born of humans. They are born of less than humans. And therefore, the ideology is because they are truly not white and they are truly not human, you can kill them. And in fact, they say Christ was in favor of violence. He also expelled the Jews from the temple. And therefore, if you kill Jews, you are doing their unborn children a favor because their unborn children would go to hell. So this is part of, I think, a larger, this is why, because I remember asking my rabbi once, how can people who consider themselves Christians participate in that level of anti-Semitism? And we got talking about Christian identity as well as other things.
Okay, thank you. Here's Rob Satloff with a point.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much. These presentations are absolutely terrific. I have no academic expertise on these issues, but I thought that the group would be interested in hearing a brief personal story, in addition to whatever I do for a living. I may be the only person in this room that was once kidnapped by the KKK and held hostage by them in a small town in North Carolina now 41 years ago. And just to put a historical sheen on this, some people around this table may remember an event in Overland, Kansas, a small suburb of Kansas City, exactly 10 years ago, when an elderly guy took out a rifle and shot people outside a Jewish community center of Overland, Kansas, hoping to kill Jews. In the end, he didn't kill any Jews. He killed not ordinary, everyone's ordinary. He killed a group of non-Jews that happened to be using the Jewish community center. But he wanted to kill Jews. That guy was named Glenn Miller. Glenn Miller... I'm sorry?
A musician?
Not that Glenn Miller. This guy was named Glenn Miller, and Glenn Miller, in a previous existence, was the Grand Dragon of the Carolina Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. And when I was 19 years old, I was an editor of the Duke University daily newspaper, The Chronicle, and came across a small item in the Raleigh News and Observer that referred to Glenn Miller. And I said, you know what? This would make a great story. People at Duke don't know that there's a Ku Klux Klan guy who lives less than an hour from our campus. And so, in a fit of youthful exuberance, I called him up. You could do that in those days. Just look online, not even online. Call 411. You don't even know what that means. Call 411, get the information, and just call him up, which I did, and said I'd like to come over for an interview. And he was very glad to have me for an interview as long as there were two conditions: no blacks, no Jews allowed. I readily agreed. Got a crew cut, got a fake press pass, put a cross around my neck. My big mistake was to take a photographer who looked like he was straight out of Hitler Youth. Tall, blonde, blue-eyed, lovely guy. Anyway, we drove down to the small town in North Carolina, which turned out to be a paramilitary training camp. There was a bunch of guys out back in marine or military outfits with submachine guns.
I understand why you like to do research.
Exactly. With submachine guns, practicing in the backyard, shooting practice, that sort of thing. Anyway, I knocked on the door, walked into the house. We sat down. We started the interview. 10 minutes into the interview, Glenn Miller starts going like this. I smell a Jew. I smell a Jew. And I say, well, I look around, I say, I don't know who you're looking at, because you set some rules and I follow my rules. Anyway, to make a longer story short, after another couple of minutes, he says, not only do I smell a Jew, but you blush like a Jew, you look like a Jew, you are a Jew. He pulls out a revolver, and he takes me outside and he locks me up in a car for the next 7 hours. And I stay in this hot, spring North Carolina car. Every 10 minutes, somebody walks by and waves a pistol under my nose just to scare the daylights out of me, quite successful. And in the meantime, they try to recruit my blonde, blue-eyed photographer to join the club. As it turns out, thankfully, at the end of the day, I was let go. We were let go. We were told, to get out of here, never come back. We paid. He came out in his full Ku Klux Klan regalia for my photographer friend to be able to take a picture of him, and we left. And then we drove straight into the local town in order to go to the police station, since I figured that the local police would at least be moderately interested to find out that tax-paying residents of North Carolina were being held against their will at gunpoint in this town. And as it turns out, after we explained all this to the police chief of the local town, he said, he looked at both of us and he said, "Glenn, that good old boy, you really shouldn't be going where you're not wanted," to me. And he urged that, he suggested that we leave town and not return. So I tell you this story not because it has any special value other than to point out that occurred in 1981. And then 33 years later, that guy, still motivated by that same anti-Jewish hatred that kept deep inside of him, it just kept going and kept going and kept going. It's like what he lived for. He ended up, 1,500 miles away with a shotgun in his hand, and he killed 4 innocent people outside a Jewish community center in Overland, Kansas, outside of Kansas City. You can read this. I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post the day after the killings in Overland about my experiences 33 years earlier, just to underscore how deep and abiding this hatred can be.
How did you respond after?
So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rose. Thanks. No, if you can come here, who else has a question? I know Christine, I see Christine. Anybody else who hasn't asked questions recently would like to ask a question?
I have chills.
Come sit here. Thank you.
Can you see me? Hi, hello. Thank you very much for your talk. Hi, I wanted to ask Steve, please, a question. So I go to the University of Bergen, Norway, and I'm writing my master's thesis on Jewish reactions to anti-Semitism in Norway after 1945. And this includes, of course, the attitudes of those Jews to events and incidents which they considered to be anti-Semitic, and what this means and what reaction means, including, of course, the decision to keep your head down and stay silent. And Leonard Dinerstein wrote, if I remember correctly, on the first post-war years in the US, that the active combat against anti-Semitism was successful precisely because it was done in various fronts. And then other scholars kind of established that our most powerful tool as Jews in this combat is actually other actors who are influential, who are maybe, organizations or individuals of, non-Jews who might, be in our favor. So I wanted to ask you, please, what approaches and strategies do you conclude then have been proved to be efficient in combating anti-Semitism? And what fronts do we need to fight on and focus on? And learning from the case of, the US, of post-war US, how do we deal with anti-Semitism where it is not apparent or where we do not have the support necessarily of larger non-Jewish actors, and where Jewish communities can be very small and marginalized? I hope this is clear. Thank you very much.
If I could really, excuse me, if I could give a definitive answer for that, I should be in government running the FBI or something equivalent. The answer is, certainly from the 1930s on, Jews have had to rely on themselves, is what I would say. That during the whole history of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, what we've seen is government authorities, particularly House Un-American Activities Committee, that's supposed to look into un-American activities on the left and right, has been really only concerned with activities on the far left. And what has protected Jews all these years has been undercover operations that they've run. And I will say this, I've given several talks for the Anti-Defamation League after my book Hitler in Los Angeles came out. And at one of those talks, Jonathan Greenblatt was there, and I offered to go and speak to any ADL group he wanted in the country, no fee, but in exchange, I wanted access to the ADL spy reports from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and he refused. He said, I'm not going to let you see them because we're still spying and we're using the same techniques. And for the history I've looked at from 45 through the 80s, most of the incidents of anti-Semitism, most of the attempts to stop hate groups from actually taking hate speech into hate action and violent action has been done because of these Jewish undercover groups that have then fed information to police, FBI, Army intelligence, Navy intelligence, the CIA, and other groups. Because it's ultimately up to them that is the non-Jewish groups, to use the authority that they have to stop these groups. Because I will tell you this, the anti-Semitic critics of these operations, the most famous post-war one being the journalist Westbrook Pegler, dubbed these various, the ADL, the AJC, and the Anti-Nazi League as, they call them the Jewish Gestapo, that they had no right to have Jews spying on Amish Christians. And I would say it's been the same way ever since. It's one of the reasons the ADL doesn't want it known that they are still spying on these right-wing anti-Semitic and anti-racist groups.
Thank you.
Or racist groups, rather.
Thank you.
Hi, good day. My name is Nadia. Thank you very much for your wonderful speeches. I would like, Ellen, to ask you some question about, Soviet propaganda and women human rights movements. I mean, I have read a lot about, international campaign, women campaign to support Soviet Jewry and against, the campaign against Soviet propaganda. And I would like you to ask you in general, your point of view about the impact of women human rights organizations, and specifically the human rights organizations that we had in the countries of former Soviet Union, and their impact on American Jewry and America in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for an excellent question. The human rights whole complexion of organizations, plus their NGOs, and the social justice legacy as well, are used today as a camouflage, as a mask of using a language that is not understood as really like a front organization for the continuation of some of the worst atrocities against Jews and against people who really do need help. So what we see is the following, is that from the very beginning of when the Soviets become active in this particular issue, there is a change between 1947 and 1971. One of the things that we see with the Soviets is they have a hold on the United Nations, on its committee structure, on the NGOs, which is very, very dangerous and insidious. Let me just give you a comparison. You have in the history of the Soviet Union a refusal to deal with the issue of anti-Semitism. And in the very early ages, when the Soviets are going to support Israel in 1947, Gromyko makes an extraordinary address in 1947, in which, for the first time, there is what appears to students like you and me a breakthrough. And here are his words. And that will give us a basis of speaking. On April 28, 1947, there was a special session of the United Nations General Assembly. The USSR's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Gromyko, received the following instructions from Moscow. And remember, at this point, Moscow wants to assist Israel to get a foothold for itself within the Middle East and to get the British out. Okay, so on the grounds that during World War II, he speaks the following. This is the first time we hear Jews defined as a people through the voice of the Soviets. He goes, I was instructed from Moscow to prepare a speech that would present a completely new line on the Palestine question, on the grounds that during World War II, the Jewish people experienced unparalleled disaster and suffering. This is the first time. Gromyko was told to propose two different solutions of Palestine, should the first solution prove impractical because of the deterioration of Jewish-Arab relations. He says the following. During the war, the Jewish people experienced the most massive sorrow and suffering. Without any exaggeration, one can say this sorrow and suffering are truly incredible. It is difficult to express them in dry statistics, he says, of the Jewish victims of the fascist aggressors. The Jews in territories where the Hitlerites held sway, subjected to the almost complete physical annihilation. Large numbers of surviving Jews of Europe, were deprived of their countries, their homes, and their livelihood. He goes on to say something even more amazing. He goes on to say the following: what happened to the Jews is indeed an unpleasant fact that can never happen again to any people. This fact explains, he says, the aspirations of Jews to establish their own state. It would be entirely unjust to take this into consideration and to ever deny the right of this people, the Jewish people, to realize this aspiration. Compare this to 1971. Now, this is a period of time of 30 years when you begin to really get, over a longitudinal period, the extent to which the UN is used, and especially their Human Rights Council, etc., to act against Jews. And this is Malik, Yaakov Malik. First of all, he gets up and says, excuse me, that the Six-Day War victory for Israel resulted in an intense propaganda campaign with a focus on the demonization and the delegitimization of Zionism, Israel, and Jewry. Israel is surprised. Their surprise attack that started in 1967 war can be compared to Nazis attacking on the Soviet Union in 1941. In September 1971, Malik intensifies the Soviet propaganda, equating Zionism as the evil incarnate and further developing the legitimacy of defining and promoting the role of Zionism equals racism. And these are his words. The Israeli ambassador to the UN is indignant at our parallel between Zionism and fascism, Zionism as racism. But why? It is all very simple. Both are totally racist ideologies. The fascists advocated the superiority of the Aryan race as the highest among all races and all people of the world. The fascists considered the ideal was the Aryan with blue eyes and blonde hair. I do not know what the external signs of a Zionist are, but I can tell you one thing. They are a racist group, and this is a racist theory. The fascists advocated hatred towards all people, and the Zionist does the same. The chosen people, is this not racism? What is the difference between Zionism and fascism, he says, if the essence of Zionism is entirely racism and hatred towards other people? The chosen people, the people elected by God, where in the second half of the 20th century does one hear anyone advocating this criminal, absurd theory of the superiority of one race and one people over others? Try to justify that from the rostrum of the United Nations. Try to prove that you are a chosen people and others are nobodies, and you will be laughed out of diplomacy. So we have in this 30-year period, what is going to be followed is an internationalization of this kind of hatred. And we had one brief moment, but again, a lot of my work that I would be really delighted to send to you is about the internationalization of how they did this, the Soviets, to make sure that this was not an isolated institution. And so, under Khrushchev, his major contribution to education is the development of what he called friendship universities. He goes to every third world liberation nation in Southeast Asia, in Africa especially, and in Latin America, and creates international educational programs, which these are the following elements. One, Marxist Leninism. And he goes on. It's all a litany. One of the first students is Ahmazan, the head of the role, as you know today, a person who doesn't believe in elections anymore after 12 years. And so when we look at the list many world leaders, this was a training ground, besides the United Nations, for how to understand the Jew as the worst evil. So, again, when we're looking at the issue of the national rights, of human rights, the people who are viewed today in most countries by most NGOs is the State of Israel, is the Jews, and are the NGOs that are working to end human rights violations. We're up a very, very difficult road on human rights legislation, and I know that you got to hear the wonderful contributor of from Canada, human rights,
Erwin Cutler.
and Urban Cutler, thank you, and he argues so strongly that it is worse now than 50 years ago when he started. And that is what we are finding now. We're in a very difficult position.
Thank you,
But
Ellen.
thank you for your excellent question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellen. So we're running out of time, but I promised Christine a quick question, and then we're going to have to end because we have another program in 14 minutes. So please, Christine.
Yeah, it's about Khrushchev, since you asked us to ask you a question about that. He repudiated Stalinism initially
Yes.
in 56. But he didn't say a word about the Jews at that point, right?
Exactly. Or especially even the initial period of the Babi Yar.
Right.
Please,
So my question
yeah,
is,
please, we got to go.
you know, so you were very keen to say something about him, and you just did. Is that what you were going to say specifically? Or could you have one other thing to add about him and his impact?
Yes. Yes,
Sorry to rush you.
absolutely. And thank you, Christina. Many times when we're having these discussions, we see you in the audience, and thank you for your continued interest all of the time.
Okay.
Khrushchev, again.
Sorry, Ellen,
claims to-
you have 60 seconds to respond. I'm very sorry. We have to go.
Sure.
Sorry.
He claims to give the secret speech in which Stalinization is evaporated, but he continues in a vein in
Gesund.
which his entire road is the greater institutionalization globally of the notion of Zionism equals racism. And he is very successful at this, together with his UN platform. But other than claiming not to be a mass murderer and having show trials, he is a true person who continues the old framework of Lenin, Stalin in most ways. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Steve and Ellen, thank you. Sorry to rush you a little bit at the end. We have a program.